want you to think back to January of 2025 when Donald Trump was being inaugurated for his second presidential term, because the Democrat Party and the media class that serves as its ministry of propaganda made a set of very specific, very confident predictions about what was about to happen to this country as soon as Donald Trump got elected. It is long overdue that we go back and we hold them accountable for every single one. They told you the economy was going to crash. They told you democracy was going to die. They told you NATO was going to collapse. They told you the border was unfixable without their legislation. They told you Trump was going to blunder us into World War III. And they didn't say any of this as a maybe or as a concern or a risk worth monitoring. They said it as if it were settled fact, with the confidence of people who were absolutely certain that they were right and who fully expected to be vindicated within mere months. Well, 500 days later, we have the receipts. So let's go through them. Lie number one were that Trump's tariffs were going to destroy the economy. When Trump announced his tariff agenda, and especially after Liberation Day in April of 2025, when he unveiled the worldwide reciprocal tariff regime, the economic establishment lost its collective mind, and it was frankly really entertaining to watch, and also kind of impressive because they rarely agree on almost anything, but they did agree on this. And we're not talking about a few fringe voices here. I'm telling you, it was the mainstream economic establishment, and the big forecasters on Wall Street were, by virtually every account, completely united in this one prediction: that tariffs would trigger stagflation at best and a deep recession at worst. Inflation would surge and supply chains would collapse entirely. The stock market would tank, and the American economy, which has already been battered by 4 years of Biden-era inflation and horrific mismanagement, would be plunged into something resembling another Great Depression. So what actually happened? Well, the economy didn't crash. Unemployment has stayed below 5%. GDP has kept expanding at a fairly moderate pace. The stock market has continued to rise. The S&P 500 has kept climbing. So has the NASDAQ. In fact, 2025 was one of the craziest years for investors that they ever saw. There was not only because the stock market was a little volatile and there were a huge amount of investment opportunities to get in on, but the stock market developed calluses. And let me explain what I mean. Trump did a lot of things in his first year, which people would call crazy and maybe not good for the stock market. And they caused volatility and price swings and things were all over the place. But one of the net benefits of that was that the stock market just got used to it. And now something huge happens like the Iran war, and there's some movement. Yeah, there's always movement when something big is announced, but it's not huge. In fact, it's pretty minuscule. And while that may be bad news for investors like me who capitalize on those stock swings to try to make money, it's great news for the stock market as a whole because it means the stock market is not as sensitive as it was before to the slightest little thing that the president said or does. Compare that to Biden, where stuff was insane. It was all over the place. The volatility was absolutely crazy. And it was because they learned they can't trust the Oval Office. The Oval Office might haul off and do some wild thing. But the stock market as a whole has recognized that under Trump, they can trust the Oval Office. And what Trump does usually turns out okay in almost every instance across the board economically, because Trump is a businessman and he understands economics. And the stock market is doing great as a result. And it's probably going to continue that way for a long time because he's made it better. He has desensitized it to just popular control. And inflation, while still above where we would want it, never came close to the generational catastrophe that they'd been predicting all along. It averaged an annualized rate of just 1.4% through the first stretch of Trump's term, while the private sector just kept adding jobs on a pace that consistently beat expectations and is a billion times better than what it was under Biden, including in April of this year when economists projected 55,000 new jobs and got 115,000 instead. Now, I want to be honest with you here because this is the whole point of the show. I want you to listen very carefully. The economy is not perfect. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that it is. Groceries are expensive, okay? Housing is brutal. I live in California. Housing is horrible here. The housing prices are absolutely unreal. People who are making a lot of money, they can't afford a home because it is unreal here. The regulation costs are just out of this world. They are literally out of this world. In our county alone, to build a very small structure on your property, it's going to cost you 20 or 30 grand in permits. The regulation is crazy. People can't build. And so there's a huge housing shortage, and housing prices are absolutely insane. But all over the rest of the country, housing prices are not as bad as California. They're still bad. And it is a universal truth that Gen Z is going to have a very, very hard time buying houses. In 1990, the average first-time home buyer was just 28 years old. In 2026, the average first-time home buyer is 41 years old. That tells you all you need to know. Housing is super, super expensive. Trump has not fixed that yet. It's something he's going to get around to, and it's something that's going to come with time and with work. Biden screwed a lot of stuff up. A lot of American families are still genuinely struggling with costs that exploded under Biden and haven't fully come back down. Okay, gas is super, super high right now. It's nearing $7 a gallon here in California. Now, that has a lot to do with the Iran war and the conflict that's going on right now. Obviously, that conflict is going to be over soon. There's no reason to question that. Trump wants out of the conflict. It is clear as day, no matter what Tucker Carlson is trying to tell you. So that will end eventually. That is not going to be forever. It is temporary. And frankly, I'm willing to suffer high gas prices so that the Iranian regime, the most evil, corrupt, and brutal terroristic regime on the face of the planet, is annihilated, and that threat to American lives is ended. So that's a trade-off I'm willing to make, and it should be a trade-off you're willing to make too. So all these things are real problems, and they deserve real answers, and they deserve real solutions. But the specific prediction that Democrats made, which is the confident, mockery-laden, Trump is going to destroy everything prediction, that was a crash, and the crash never happened. And this matters a lot more than it might seem, because these are the exact same people who told you that Biden's $6 trillion in deficit spending wouldn't cause inflation, and were catastrophically wrong about that one too. At some point, you just have to ask yourself, why is anyone even listening to these people anymore? Who cares what they think? They clearly don't know economics. Every time they get in control of anything, they turn it into a dumpster fire. Look at California. California has been Democrat controlled for a very, very long time. It is a dumpster fire. We can't afford houses here. We can barely afford gas. We can't afford groceries. Crime is through the roof. Stuff is, it is literally insane. Companies are moving out of California at an unbelievable rate because of our Democrat leadership. But they want to lecture Trump on his economics, which have been working every time and are currently fixing all those Biden-era problems. So that's line number one. Line number two is that Trump is going to end American democracy. This one is worth dwelling on because of how specific and how extreme it was. Before Trump was even sworn in for his second term, 91% of Democrat voters told pollsters they believed that his reelection posed a genuine threat to American democracy and way of life, clearly because they're all watching too much CNN. And the rhetoric from Democratic leadership, from left-wing media, and from the academic class at our colleges across the nation that feeds it, wasn't much more measured. Like, it was pretty much about there. And in some cases, a lot more radical. We heard authoritarian, we heard fascist, we heard careful comparisons to the collapse of Weimar Germany and the consolidation of power in Hungary. We heard that elections would be abolished forever, that the Supreme Court would be captured or simply ignored, that the constitutional system of checks and balances that has held this country together for 250 years would be dismantled by a man with a grudge and an executive order. So where are we 500 days into this supposedly fatal authoritarian turn? Well, the courts are still running, and not just running in a friendly way, because they're constantly blocking Trump's administration policies on multiple fronts. They're issuing injunctions, they're overturning executive actions. They're doing exactly what the independent judiciary is supposed to do. Now, to be clear, I don't support judges just wantonly overruling what the president says. But the point is that the judiciary is still functioning, and a lot of the time they're not doing things that Trump likes. So if Trump really was this tyrannical dictator who is going to end the justice system entirely, why hasn't he done it yet? Because so far, the justice system has proved to be one of the biggest threats to his administration. They're stopping like everything he does, with the exception of the Supreme Court. So if Trump really had the power to stop them, if he was really going to be this tyrannical dictator who's going to end the judicial system, why hasn't he done it yet? That's a question you need to ask your Democrat friend. And Congress is still in session. I would know because you can hear the screaming sounds coming from Capitol Hill as they all shriek over like the most useless things in the face of the planet and do their usual, get paid $200,000 a year to do their usual, which is get pretty much nothing done, which isn't the fault of a lot of the Republicans, by the way. It's basically just the fault of the Democrats. The midterm elections scheduled for November of 2026 are still happening. The press is still publishing. They're loudly complaining about literally everything that Trump does, platforming all sorts of Democrats, including Hassan Piker, who loves to incite all sorts of violence against capitalists, saying we need to spill their blood in the streets and overturn the government and all sorts of things. I still don't understand why he hasn't been arrested and deported yet. Like, can we just get on that already? Opposition senators like Bernie Sanders and Chuck Schumer, they're still forcing floor votes. They're still giving speeches. They're still appearing on cable news every single night. James Comey just got indicted and responded by going to Substack to declare he's not afraid and he still believes in the judiciary, which is in itself a rather remarkable thing to be able to do in a country that has supposedly ended democracy. You know, one would think something would happen to him for saying that. Nothing happened to him. He's going to be fine. And all the No Kings protests, I find it hilarious. You know, if they really, really, really had a king, there would be no Kings protests because it doesn't work that way. But these people don't read history books, and it's not entirely their fault in a lot of cases. Their public school teachers really never read history books, and so this is what we get. Now, I'll acknowledge the legitimate version of this concern because I think it exists. There are real constitutional debates happening right now about executive power, about the War Powers Act, and about what a president can and cannot do unilaterally. And I'm willing to talk about those debates. Those are fine debates to have. I have my own positions on them. Other conservatives have other positions. That's completely fine. That we can dialogue about that. We can have a conversation. We can debate about it. And then we can go our own ways and nothing really happens. But that's a completely different thing from panicking about Trump being a Hitler and talking about the end of democracy, the literal end of American democracy. The Democrats were not raising careful constitutional concerns about executive overreach. They were predicting the literal abolition of the American system of government, and 500 days later, that system is not only intact, but it is actively being used to constrain the president they were so afraid of. If that's what the death of democracy looks like, it's a surprisingly functional death. In fact, it looks like democracy is still alive and kicking, like really, really hard. So that's line number 2. Line number 3 is that Trump will blow up NATO and abandon all of our allies. The foreign policy establishment they were absolutely convinced about this one. Trump was going to withdraw from NATO on day 1, or he was going to do it on day 2 or day 3. He was very close to it, right? He was going to hand Europe to Putin on a silver platter. America's allies would flee the relationship in horror, and oh no, the whole world would erupt in flames and whatever. Just pure panic. Just panic. They all said the post-World War II order, which was built painstakingly over decades, would collapse under the weight of one president's indifference to the institutions his predecessors had built. You heard this from Democrats. You even heard it from Republican, quote-unquote, Republican foreign policy veterans who hadn't become never-Trumpers. You heard it from European leaders who were barely concealing their panic in the months before his inauguration. And frankly, it was funny watching them all collectively lose their minds. But let's check in on NATO. How is NATO doing? Well, aside from their complete uselessness in helping us in anything related to Iran, NATO still exists, and America is still a part of NATO, and America is still funding NATO, like funding a lot of NATO. Here's the part that should really, really, really embarrass the people who made this prediction. The Iran conflict, Operation Epic Fury, which is going on right now, which the U.S. launched in February of this year, stress tested the alliance in a way that Trump's rhetoric alone is never going to stress test it. And, well, the alliance adapted. I mean, I'm not saying the response was correct. I don't believe it was correct. It was trash, actually. But it survived it, and it's still holding together. There are tensions, clearly. European allies are really, really mad at Trump. Not justifiably so. They have no idea what they're talking about. They're just leftists who have to pretend like they somewhat like Trump. And I know they're leftists because they can't run their country. All their countries are trash. They're all falling to pieces. Germany is gone. France is gone. Great Britain is gone. Scotland is gone. Ireland is gone. All of them. All of them are gone. They are shells of their former selves. And it's just hell over there. I've been listening to a lot of what Tommy Robinson and the conservative movement on that side of the world is doing, and it is horrifying. If you don't know who Tommy Robinson is, look it up. Look him up on X and on YouTube and check him out. Support his work. Watch his videos. Listen to him on podcasts. What he is doing maybe might save the shell of Europe that is left. It's doubtful, but it may do it. And everything is just insane over there. So they can't even manage their own countries. But an alliance being tested by genuine disagreement over a military conflict in the Middle East is not the same as an alliance collapsing. I'll say that again. It is not the same as an alliance collapsing. Just because the president said mean things about it at a press conference, which was the scenario Democrats had in mind. And on Russia and Ukraine, the story that was supposed to prove that Trump was Putin's puppet all along, I want you to pay attention to where we are today, because Trump just brokered a 3-day ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine that includes a 1,000 for 1,000 prisoner swap, with both Zelensky and Putin agreeing to it at Trump's direct personal request. 1,000 Ukrainian prisoners of war are coming home this weekend because of Donald Trump, the man who was supposedly going to hand Ukraine to Russia and walk away. You can have legitimate disagreements about the broader strategy. There are real questions about whether a lasting peace deal requires Ukraine to give a bunch of territory to Russia. But the whole Trump is going to abandon our allies and blow up the Western Alliance prediction has, not gone particularly well. That's line number 3. Line number 4 is that the border crisis is too complex to fix without Democrat legislation. This was the most cynically constructed lie on the list, and I want you to understand why, because it really, really matters. For years, and genuinely for years, the Democrats and a significant portion of the Washington establishment told you that the only solution to the border crisis was a comprehensive legislative solution, that executive action alone couldn't fix it, and that the structural problems were too deep and too entrenched for any president to address alone without Congress passing a major bill that conveniently would include every Democratic priority from a pathway to citizenship to expanded legal immigration to asylum reform. The message, delivered with a straight face and a sorrowful shake of the head and maybe some crocodile tears, was that nothing could be done without their cooperation. That was a lie, a bold-faced lie, and it was a trap. It was designed as a trap because the Democrats knew they could always block whatever legislation Republicans wanted to pass, which meant that if you accepted the premise that legislation was the only solution, you had also accepted that the border would never actually be secured. It was learned helplessness, frankly, being sold as political expertise. So Trump took office. He ignored the premise entirely, which is exactly what he should have done, and he deployed every executive tool he had. There were mass deportations. There were military assets at the border. The end of catch and release policy, which had been going on for a long time under Biden and other presidents, which essentially just released a ton of criminals into our country. Border Patrol would catch them sneaking in. They'd arrest them. They'd serve them papers, tell them you're showing up for such and such court date. And then they release them into America, and they never show up for that court date. Surprise, surprise. He reinstated Remain in Mexico. He terminated the NGO pipeline that had been functionally just running as a processing operation for illegal migrants. And for the first time in 50 years, the migration into the United States went negative. We're not talking about slower growth, not talking about a reduction in the rate of increase. Negative. There are more people leaving the United States than arriving. And the homicide drop that accompanied that enforcement surge was the largest ever recorded, which shouldn't surprise anybody who has been paying attention to the relationship between open borders, cartel activity — turns out the cartel commits a lot of the homicides, and crime in American communities, which apparently came as a complete shock to the political class that has spent 4 years assuring you there was nothing to be done about the border crisis. It was just going to continue on forever until America wasn't even America. That's line number 4. Line number 5 is that Trump's foreign policy is going to start World War III. Now, this is perhaps the most dramatic lie, so I've saved it for last. The foreign policy establishment's consensus, and I want to be clear, this was not only Democrats, but this was also a large portion of the Republican foreign policy class that just had decided Trump was too dangerous to be trusted with the presidency. They all said that this chaotic, norm-violating, unpredictable approach to international relations was potentially going to blunder us into a catastrophic military conflict from which there would be no clean exit. And it would basically be Iraq 2.0. And we'd be just stuck there forever. World without end, amen, until Jesus comes back. They said it was going to end the world in nuclear escalation with Russia over Ukraine. And there was going to be military confrontation between China and Taiwan. And just an uncontrolled spiral in the Middle East that would consume the region and drag in the great powers. This was presented not as a worst case scenario, but as a certainty. I mean, the confidence with which these people said this is unbelievable. And they said it was the inevitable result of putting a madman in charge who didn't understand the rules, a madman in charge of the most powerful military on earth, someone who didn't understand the rules. Well, here's where we actually are. On Russia and Ukraine, as I already mentioned, there is a ceasefire today. The most serious peace negotiations in 4 years are underway. On China, Trump is heading to Beijing next week for a summit with Xi Jinping, with Boeing, and with Citigroup CEOs in tow for what appears to be a significant economic deal. And the relationship, while tense, especially with what's going on in the Strait of Hormuz, is being managed, and managed expertly, through diplomacy, rather than just exploding into the open conflict everyone predicted. On Iran, yes, there is a war going on, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But here's the thing about Iran that the World War III crowd never wants to address directly. When Trump took office, Iran was months away from a functional nuclear weapon. The Obama deal had expired, and the Biden negotiations had collapsed. Iran's nuclear program was advancing toward a point of no return, with the stated goal, publicly and repeatedly, of annihilating the United States and Israel. The Ayatollah would lead huge crowds and chants of death to America. Trump struck that nuclear infrastructure. He eliminated that program. This is a significant strategic achievement. And it is one that the people who spent decades managing the Iran problem rather than actually solving it couldn't bring themselves to accomplish for whatever indecipherable reason. Is the Middle East a peaceful garden of tranquility right now? Obviously not. And it won't be as long as there are radical Muslims in charge. But World War III requires a major power conflict and an uncontrolled escalation spiral that pulls in Russia and China and other world powers. And what we have instead is just a regional war being actively managed, messily and imperfectly, of course, with real costs. And there are questions about the war, and I have no problem talking about the questions. But it's being conducted alongside simultaneous diplomatic engagement across every other major front at once. They predicted chaos and catastrophe. What we got was complicated, and it was contested, and it was sometimes concerning, I'll admit. I think Trump has come through on everything. I think his foreign policy record is spotless, and it will remain spotless. But it would be a complete lie to say that it's going to turn into World War III. The people who told you it would be owe you a massive explanation for why on earth they were so wrong and why we should ever listen to them on anything ever again. So that's 5 lies, 5 failed predictions from the same people who told you COVID was nothing to worry about and then told you to never leave your house, who told you that Biden's spending. That's 5 lies, 5 failed predictions from the people who told you that Biden's spending wouldn't cause inflation and then spent 3 years explaining why the inflation it caused was actually Trump's fault because of his 2016 election. People who told you that the border was structurally unfixable, that the economy would collapse, that democracy would end and NATO would fall apart and the world would go up in flames, all within 500 days of a president they personally despise taking office. Here's what I think is actually true about all of this, and I want you to sit with it for a second. I don't think most of those people were making predictions. They weren't making predictions. In fact, I know they weren't making predictions. They were making weapons. A prediction is something you make because you genuinely believe it's true and because you're willing to be held accountable if it turns out to be wrong. But what the Democrats and the media establishment were doing was something that was radically different. They were manufacturing panic. They were manufacturing a sense of impending catastrophe that was designed to paralyze, demoralize, and frighten people into political compliance. And it was designed to get out the vote. Let's just face it. The most powerful political weapon any politician has is fear. If you elect my opponent, the world will end. Now, the problem with doing this, of course, is that at some point, It's the boy who cried wolf. We've elected your opponent 6 times in a row. It's been 30 years, and the world has yet to end. Okay. Well, I wasn't really telling the truth. I only kind of meant it. I mean, some bad stuff is still going to happen, and then we elect the opponent again, and the world doesn't end again. And in fact, things get far, far better than they were under the person telling us, if you elect my opponent, the world's going to end. That's the situation. The Democrats are not going to be able to keep this up forever. They can only keep it up so long before a lot of people start realizing, Chuck Schumer keeps saying that, and Hakeem Jeffries, they keep getting up at press conferences and just saying that this is the end of humankind. Donald Trump, it will just be the end. Republicans will be the end. J.D. Vance will be the end. Marco Rubio will be the end. DeSantis will be the end. And then the world just blithely continues rotating. People don't die. Stuff is completely chill. In fact, it's a lot better. Prices go down. Inflation goes down. The stock market goes up. World peace is accomplished. That's where we're at. I think it's only a matter of time before the Democrats, they have gone as far as they can go. There are no more dramatic claims they can make than the United States is going to end because of Donald Trump. They're making them, and to their own demise. But they're never going to admit being wrong about any of this, because the point was never accuracy or truth. They don't care about the truth. If they did, they wouldn't be Democrats. The point is fear. The point is to instill panic in you. This is also why I don't support Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens or Megyn Kelly or Nick Fuentes or anyone else who panics about everything. Alex Jones, Steve Bannon, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Thomas Massey, Rand Paul. How many more do I need to name? Joe Kent, Daryl Cooper. They panic about everything. Everything is the end of the world for them. And they get subscribers and they get listeners because there's a whole market for that. The tabloids in the supermarket checkout line, that's what they go off of too. That's their entire customer base. It's people who like to feel a chill run down their spine as they wonder, will the world end in the next 7 days? Spoiler, it won't. And the best thing you could possibly do is just chill out and stop, get off your phone, stop reading the tabloids, stop listening to Tucker Carlson, go outside, take your dog for a walk, hang out with your family, spend time in the real world, touch grass, as my generation likes to say. That's the best thing you could possibly do. And that's why I don't support Tucker Carlson. It's the exact same thing the left is doing. They're trying to make you panic. They're trying to make you fear. And in doing so, they are manipulating you. You know what the number one thing that salespeople will try to do, scammers, when you pick up the phone? The number one thing they'll try to do is give you a sense of impending urgency. If you do not do X right now, you'll miss out on the deal of a lifetime. They're trying to create panic. They're trying to create fear. That is a manipulative tactic. It is one that is never honest. Never. It's someone who actually cares about you, someone who's actually there for your good, is not going to create panic, and they're not going to create fear. They're going to give you the truth, and they're going to tell you, here's what we can do about it. Here's how we can mitigate the problem. Here's how we can solve the problem. That's not what the left is doing. That's not what the alt-right is doing. And then back to the boy who cried wolf thing, the deeper problem with this strategy, besides the obvious one of being deeply dishonest and manipulative, is that it leaves the Democrats and it leaves the alt-right with no credibility for the moments when something is actually worth being alarmed about. 500 days of being wrong at the top of your lungs has consequences for whether anyone believes you, and honestly, I think that's exactly what the Democrat Party deserves. They need to slowly crumble and fade from existence, and people need to forget that anything they said ever mattered, because the vast majority of it was a lie. I'm Carson Wagner. This is The Carson Wagner Show. If this was useful to you, please share it with someone who you think it also might be useful for. You can subscribe to my blog at carsonwagner.substack.com. You can check out this show at thecarsonwagnershow.substack.com. You can subscribe below if you want to see more content like this. If you have any questions, comments, criticisms, anything else, you can put them down in the comments. I read every single one. I respond to it, as many as I can. You can also email me at thecarsonwagnershow@gmail.com. I'll see you on the next episode.